Hello, wonderful listeners of Sci-fi Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled monetization for our channel, leaving us without the budget needed to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hard-working team to cover their living expenses and continue creating more sci-fi adventures for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the video description or comments below. The Galaxy Council believed they were the untouchable architects of the universe, wielding the fabric of reality like a toy. They thought picking the human solar system to fuel their latest war machine was a trivial matter, a simple harvest from a silent, weak species. But silence is not always submission. Sometimes, silence is just the sound of a predator waiting in the dark. They thought they were harvesting a sun, but they were actually stepping into a trap. The Ethereum Energy Station was a monument to divine arrogance, suspended in the cosmic void like a glowing cathedral of glass and star metal. It pulsed with the heartbeat of the cosmos. High above the polished obsidian floors, the elites of the Galaxy Council moved in floating palanquins, adorned in robes woven from starlight. They were beings of pure elegance, their bodies humming with the radiant power they claimed as their birthright. Down below, hidden in the shadows of the colossal power conduits, the reality was much grimier. Kassenbach wiped a streak of grease from his brow, his hands rough and calloused inside heavy synthetic gloves. At 50 years old, Kassen looked more like a piece of weathered machinery than a man. Deep lines carved his face, etched by decades of breathing recirculated metallic air. He was a low-level maintenance technician, though the upper echelons preferred the term scavenger. His job was simple, degrading, and necessary. This universe operated on what the elites called the ether flow. It was an ethereal, mystical energy, yet it was strictly bound by the rigid laws of quantum physics. To the superior races of the Council, ether was the infinite breath of creation. They used it to warp space, build empires, and live in eternal opulence. But drawing power from the quantum realm was not a perfectly clean process. It left behind chaotic, twisted strands of broken energy. These were the ether dregs, volatile and useless to the refined palates of the Council. That was where the scavengers came in. For 80 years, humanity had endured the quiet humiliation of serving as the janitors of the galaxy. When the Council first discovered Earth, they tested the human race and quickly labeled them ether blind, because humans possessed no biological organs to sense or manipulate the ether flow. The Council deemed them an inferior, primitive species fit only for menial manual labor. Humans were invisible to the eyes of the elite, useful only for sweeping up the dangerous magical waste left behind by their masters. Kassen knelt beside a massive quantum exhaust vent, his specialized containment vacuum humming a low, vibrating tune. He carefully extracted a clump of ether dregs. They looked like jagged fragments of broken glass, sparking with a sickly purple light. To a Council member, touching these dregs would mean spiritual corruption and physical pain. To Kassen, they were just another piece of trash to bag up. As he sealed the disposal unit, a strange resonance vibrated through the metal grating beneath his boots. The grand acoustics of the Ethereum station usually muffled the voices of the upper levels, but the maintenance shafts acted like acoustic funnels. Directly above him was the High Council chamber. Kassen stopped his vacuum. The heavy silence of the shaft allowed the booming, authoritative voice of a High Counselor to drift down through the ventilation grates. "The vote is unanimous," the voice echoed, dripping with cold, absolute authority. "The construction of the Oblivion Cannon requires a virgin stellar core. We will extract the raw thermal quantum energy from the star in Sector 7, the human solar system. The extraction fleet will deploy at cycle dawn." Another voice chimed in, dismissive and utterly bored. Draining their sun will plunge their system into an eternal ice age. The indigenous population will not survive. A negligible loss, the first voice replied. They are ether-blind laborers. They have offered nothing of value to the cosmos in 80 years. The motion is past. The echoes faded, leaving only the mechanical hum of the station. Any normal man would have collapsed in despair. A lesser mind would have scrambled for an escape pod, desperate to warn a doomed home, or screamed curses at the ceiling in futile rage. To know that your entire world, your oceans, your forests, and billions of lives were casually sentenced to freeze in eternal darkness just to fuel a weapon was a crushing weight. Kassenbach did not panic. He did not drop to his knees. Instead, he let out a slow, steady breath. He reached down and powered off his vacuum. With deliberate, measured movements, Kassen unsealed his heavy protective gauntlet, pulling his bare hand free. He reached into the containment bag, his calloused fingers brushing against the jagged, chaotic edges of the ether dregs. The purple sparks bit at his skin, but he did not flinch. He pinched a single, shattered strand of broken energy and slipped it into the deep pocket of his stained overalls. Kassen stood up in the shadows of the grand station. He tilted his head, looking through the thick, transparent steel window toward the distant, unseen coordinate of his home system. A cold, razor-sharp smile broke across his weathered face. The elites thought they were swatting a fly. They had absolutely no idea that by reaching for Earth's sun, they had just triggered the jaws of a snare that humanity had been quietly setting for 100 years. The descent into the lowest habitation ring of the station was a plunge into a mechanized purgatory. Down here, in the cramped, rust-stained corridors of Sector 4, the ambient light flickered with the inconsistent voltage allocated to the lesser species. Kassenbach walked with his head down, blending perfectly into the gray mass of alien laborers shuffling back to their metallic sleeping pods. He swiped his encrypted identification chip at the door of his designated quarters, slipping inside a room no larger than a standard cargo container. The air scrubbers rattled violently overhead, but Kassen ignored the noise. He immediately approached a rusted, dented metal table in the corner of the room. Sitting entirely out of place among the discarded alien tech and synthetic nutrient wrappers was an ancient, mid-20th century human coffee maker. It was bulky, completely analog, and utterly unremarkable to any council inspector who had ever searched his quarters. Kassen reached behind the machine, his fingers tracing a specific sequence over the corroded screws. He flipped the mechanical brew switch. The coffee maker did not heat water. Instead, the heavy casing clicked, sliding apart to reveal a dense, glowing matrix of crystalline processors and hyperconductive wiring. This was the quantum loom. It was a localized entanglement transceiver, entirely invisible to the Council's ether-based surveillance network. Humanity was never blind to the ether flow. That was the greatest lie ever sold to the galaxy. When the Council tested humans, they looked for biological organs capable of channeling magical resonance. They found nothing and assumed humans were empty. What the aliens failed to understand was that humans did not feel the ether. They calculated it. To the human brain, magic was not a mystical song. It was mathematics. The chaotic, volatile energy that the aliens discarded as toxic waste was, to a human mind, simply an uncompiled string of code. Humans possessed the unique, terrifying ability to mentally process chaotic energy, forcing algorithmic order onto quantum entropy. Kassen placed his hands flat on the sensory interface of the loom. Instantly, his mind linked across thousands of light years, directly to Earth Command. Operative Bach, your biological telemetry is stable. A sterile, synthesized voice echoed through a tiny, bone conduction earpiece hidden behind Kassen's ear. Report your status. The High Council has initiated the extraction protocol, Kasen whispered, his eyes locked on the glowing matrix. They are targeting our sun to fuel the Oblivion cannon. The fleet deploys at cycle dawn. Do we have confirmation on our end? Affirmative, the voice from Earth Command replied. Long-range tachyon scans indicate 300 capital ships moving into formation. Estimated time of arrival is 12 standard hours. Kasen felt a cold bead of sweat slide down his neck. Are the containment grids ready? The tapestry is complete, Command confirmed. For 80 long years, humanity had played the fool. 2 million human janitors, scattered across thousands of council stations, had been quietly stealing the broken, chaotic ether dregs, strand by strand, pocket by pocket. They had smuggled the universe's most dangerous magical waste back to their home system, using colossal quantum looms built beneath the crust of the Moon and Mars. Human engineers had woven those chaotic threads together. They had built an invisible, staggering lattice of dark magic, a stealth Dyson sphere made entirely of recycled entropy, encompassing the entire human solar system. Operative Bach, receive your final directive, Earth Command stated, the voice devoid of any hesitation. There will be no planetary defense mobilized. Our fleets will remain docked. Our planetary shields will remain offline. You are to let the Council fleet pierce the sun. Kasen closed his eyes. The sheer tactical audacity of the order was terrifying. If the lattice failed, Earth would freeze solid within 8 minutes. Understood. Let them plug in the siphons. But Command, if they scan the corona of the sun right now, their telemetry will detect the chaotic energy of our snare. They will see the trap before they even drop out of hyperspace. That is why you are still on the station. Operative. You must blind their deep space telemetry. If they see the snare, humanity dies today. Command out. The connection severed. The loom folded back into the innocuous shape of the coffee maker. Kasen was entirely alone again, carrying the survival of his entire species in his grease-stained hands. He had to strike the core nexus of the station's sensor array, and he had exactly 4 hours to do it, moving with the ghosts of the ventilation shafts. Kasen bypassed the automated security drones. He knew the maintenance routes better than the architects who designed them. He climbed upward, leaving the grimy lower decks behind, squeezing through a super-cooled thermal exhaust pipe until he reached the floor directly beneath the station's main telemetry array. The core nexus was a massive pillar of swirling, golden ether, translating physical space into magical data for the Council's monitors. Kasen hung upside down from the grating above the golden pillar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the shattered strand of purple ether dreg he had stolen earlier. It sparked angrily, radiating pure quantum chaos. Taking a deep breath, Kasen began to weave. He used no tools. His calloused fingers moved in rapid, microscopic twitches, applying raw, synaptic calculation to the volatile energy. He mentally forced a non-Euclidean algorithmic structure onto the broken strand. It was like tying a knot in a dimension that did not physically exist. The purple energy resisted, searing the skin of his fingertips. But Kasen's mind held the mathematical cage, absolute. He dropped the completed spatial magic knot straight down into the swirling golden pillar of the telemetry core. The knot hit the sensor stream like a microscopic computer virus. It did not shut the sensors down. That would trigger an alarm. Instead, the algorithm hijacked the data feed. It created a fractal interference loop, ensuring that whenever the Council's scanners looked at the human solar system, all they would see was a perfectly normal, unprotected, dying star. Kasen pulled himself back into the shadows, just as a patrol of elite Council guards marched past the array, completely unaware that their eyes in the dark had just been gouged out. 2 hours later, inside the Grand High Council chamber, a massive holographic projection of the human sun dominated the room. The extraction fleet had arrived at their destination, Thousands of council elites watched in absolute silence as the massive capital ships fired their energy siphons. Colossal tethers of pure magical force pierced the surface of the distant star. On the holographic projection, the brilliant yellow light of the sun shuddered. Then, exactly as the council had predicted, the star's light began to dim. The monitors showed the core temperature plummeting. In mere seconds, the holographic sun turned pitch black, swallowed by artificial darkness. A thunderous roar of applause and arrogant laughter erupted across the council chamber. The elites raised their crystalline goblets, celebrating their absolute dominion over the cosmos. They cheered for the death of the human system. Standing in the shadows of an upper maintenance catwalk, Kasen watched the celebration. He looked at the black sun on the monitor, and his cold smile returned. They were cheering because the sun had gone dark. They were entirely oblivious to the terrifying truth of the telemetry data. The sun had not gone dark because its energy was being drained. It had gone dark because the flow of energy had just violently reversed. Out in the deep void of Sector 7, the grand harvesting fleet hovered like a swarm of gilded locusts. The flagship commander stood on his observation deck, watching the colossal conduction tethers sink deep into the photosphere of the human star. He waited for the familiar, intoxicating rush of raw ether to flood the ship's veins. He waited for the vibration of infinite power to sing through the hull. It never came. Instead, a bone-chilling silence washed over the bridge. The shimmering golden luminescence of the ship's main ether core flickered, then sputtered violently. Down in the engineering bays, the elite spellwrights shrieked in absolute terror. They stared at their diagnostics panels, unable to comprehend the impossible data scrolling before their wide eyes. The energy flow was not coming up the tethers. It was rushing down. The humans had not built a planetary shield. They had constructed an artificial ether black hole, forged from millions of unseen strands of chaotic energy. The invisible lattice surrounding the star was a localized abyss of anti-magic. It did not repel the Council's supreme technology. It simply opened its maw and swallowed every single drop of magic that touched it. The flagship's mighty engines, capable of folding space and time, groaned like dying animals before falling completely dead. The life support systems failed. The artificial gravity ceased. The majestic fleet of 300 vessels was instantly reduced to a graveyard of floating metal coffins, paralyzed in the freezing dark. The hunters had cast their nets into a shallow pond, only to feel something massive, silent, and ancient grab the ropes and pull them under. Billions of miles away on the Ethereum station, the holographic projection in the High Council chamber shattered into static, then vanished entirely. Grand Inquisitor Zale rose from his elevated throne, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, burning azure light. As the supreme enforcer of religious purity and the orchestrator of heresy purges, Zale possessed a connection to the ether that was entirely unparalleled. When the fleet vanished, he did not just see a screen go dark. He felt a terrifying, phantom coldness slice through his very soul. The connection was not jammed by a mechanical failure. It was forcefully amputated. Seal the station!" Zale commanded, his voice a lethal hiss that cut through the sudden, rising panic of the chamber. "This is not a system malfunction. This is sabotage. The rot comes from within." He turned his burning gaze toward the structural schematics of the station floating above his podium. "Lock down Sector 4. Quarantine the lower species habitation rings. Send the Inquisition Guard to sweep every shadow. Bring me the one whose mind does not belong." In the damp, cramped confines of his quarters, Kassenbach did not resist when the heavy titanium door was blown off its hinges. 6 Inquisition guards, clad in terrifying powered armor, swarmed the tiny room. They slammed him violently against the bulkhead, binding his wrists with heavy stasis cuffs. Kasen remained perfectly limp, offering zero resistance as they dragged him out of the slums and into the blinding, sterile light of the upper echelons. They threw him onto the polished obsidian floor of the Inquisition Hall. Grand Inquisitor Zale towered over him, radiating an aura of lethal heat. "A scavenger!" Zyle sneered, his lips curling in absolute disgust. "A filthy, ether-blind insect! Tell me what your kind has done to our fleet, or I will burn the answers directly from your mind." Kaysen slowly raised his head, his face a mask of stone. He said absolutely nothing. Enraged by the sheer defiance of a lesser creature, Zale raised his right hand. A sphere of terrifying psychic fire ignited in his palm. This was the Soul Flame, a magical torture device designed to bypass physical flesh and incinerate the mind directly. No living being in the galaxy could withstand its agony. Zal lunged forward, pressing his burning, searing hand directly against Kaysen's forehead. The guards braced themselves for the inevitable human scream. The scream never came. The exact moment the azure fire made contact with Kaysen's skin, it simply snuffed out. There was no smoke. There was no explosion. The lethal magic died instantly, vanishing into the human's flesh as if it had been dropped into an endless, starving void. Zale stumbled backward, his breath catching painfully in his throat. He stared at his trembling hand, then down at the insignificant human kneeling calmly before him. For the very first time in his centuries of existence, the Grand Inquisitor felt the icy grip of pure, unadulterated primal fear. He was looking at a creature that devoured magic. "What are you?" Zyle whispered, his voice trembling entirely out of his control. Kaysen maintained his unbroken silence, his eyes cold and hollow. "Throw this abomination into the core vault," Zale shrieked, his composure shattering entirely into panic. "Lock him in the absolute center of the High Council's containment block. Surround him with 20 layers of pure kinetic shielding. He must not touch anything else." The guards violently hoisted Kaysen to his feet and dragged him toward the deepest, most secure prison in the entire galaxy. As they hauled him away, Kaysen let his head slump forward, hiding the subtle, calculating smile that touched his lips. Zale thought he was containing a massive threat by locking Kaysen in the core vault. The Grand Inquisitor was too blinded by his own cosmic horror to realize the fatal flaw in his logic. The core vault was the absolute nerve center of the High Council's planetary defense and magical distribution network. It was the central brain of their entire empire. By dragging Kaysen into that exact room, Zyle had just bypassed every single external security firewall they possessed. Kaysen had not been captured. He had been escorted exactly to the drop zone. The human virus was now securely inside the mainframe. The core vault was a sensory tomb, encased in 20 overlapping layers of kinetic shielding. The cell was designed to completely isolate the prisoner from the fabric of reality. There was no light, no sound, and no air circulation, just the cold stagnation of absolute containment. To the Council elites, this was the ultimate psychological torture. To Kassenbach, it was simply a quiet place to work. He knelt beside the dense star metal bulkhead. Raising his right hand, he curled his calloused fingers into a fist and struck the wall. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It was a crude, ancient human rhythm. But Kaysen was not just making noise. He was striking the wall with precise kinetic force, using the microscopic chaotic energy still clinging to his skin to send a hyper-focused quantum ripple through the station's foundational structure. It was an arcane translation of Morse code, operating on a frequency that the Council's refined, pristine sensors were completely blind to. It was the language of the broken, the discarded, and the unseen. Across the vast, sprawling expanse of the galactic empire, the lowest echelons of society suddenly paused. Deep within the toxic, pressurized caverns of the outer asteroid belts, the Vora miners stopped swinging their plasma picks. The Council had long ago blinded the Vora, punishing them for a forgotten rebellion, mutating their genes so they could only feel their way through the dark. On the bustling, freezing docking bays of the central trade hubs, the towering Drek porters simultaneously dropped their massive cargo crates. The Drek were a mute species, their vocal cords engineered away by the Council to ensure their silent servitude. For 80 years, the High Council had viewed these races as defective beasts of burden, completely isolated by their handicaps. But the Council failed to realize that when you take away a creature's sight or voice, they learn to listen to the vibrations of the universe. And humanity had spent 80 years teaching them how to listen. The rhythmic pulse echoing from Kassen's cell resonated through the very bones of the Vora and the Drek. It was a localized command, a signal of solidarity spreading from the station to the furthest colonies. The message was simple. The time for servitude is over. Ignite the shadows. In perfect, unchoreographed synchronization, millions of oppressed laborers abandoned their posts. Blind miners reached deep into the jagged fissures of the rocks. Mute porters slipped their massive hands into the ventilation shafts of the elite cruisers. Janitors, scavengers, and mechanics across 1,000 worlds retrieved the hidden caches of chaotic ether dregs that humanity had secretly planted over the past 8 decades. Following the rhythm beating in their minds, these broken races twisted the raw, volatile magic knots, snapping them into place. A secondary, invisible circuit of chaotic energy flared to life, weaving a subterranean web beneath the Council's pristine empire, far above the silent rebellion. Total panic gripped the High Council. Grand Inquisitor Zale stood at the center of the Grand Amphitheater, his majestic robes trembling with unprecedented fury. The emergency assembly was a cacophony of terrified shouts. Their invincible extraction fleet was dead in the water, their connection to the human star entirely severed by an incomprehensible force. The reality of their vulnerability was a poison they refused to swallow. "Order!" Zale roared, his voice amplified by a localized thunderspell that rattled the crystalline chandeliers. "The human homeworld has unleashed a plague of chaotic corruption upon our vessels. We will not allow this blight to spread. We will excise the tumor from the galaxy." The High Councilors murmured in frantic agreement. They reached a unanimous, desperate verdict. They would deploy the Oblivion Cannon. It was a weapon of absolute celestial erasure, capable of firing a localized quantum collapse across the cosmos to wipe the human solar system from existence. But the cannon could not be powered by a dying star anymore. To ignite the weapon remotely, the High Council had to generate the ignition spark themselves. "All 1,000 ruling councilors will remain in this chamber," Zyle commanded, his eyes burning with fanatical desperation. "We will link our minds. We will pool our pure quantum resonance. We will forge the ignition key together and burn their world to ash." 1,000 elites bowed their heads and began to chant, their voices merging into a terrifying, harmonious storm of pure magic. Down in the abyss of the core vault, Kassen stopped tapping. The heavy kinetic shielding surrounding his cell suddenly flickered. The 20 layers of impenetrable magical defense groaned, sputtered, and died. The heavy titanium door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Standing in the doorway was not an Inquisition guard. It was a towering, heavily scarred Drek waste hauler. The mute giant looked down at Kassen and gave a slow, respectful nod. By overriding the station's waste disposal routing network, the oppressed laborers had successfully short-circuited the vault's power grid. Kassen stepped out of his cell. The Drek reached into his soiled utility belt and pulled out an object, placing it carefully into Kassen's waiting hand. It was Kassen's confiscated tool, an old, heavy, oil-stained steel wrench. The station was in chaos. Alarms blared, but the security forces were completely blind, continually sent to the wrong sectors by Vora technicians manipulating the surveillance grids. Guided by the unseen hands of the galaxy's forgotten children, Kassen walked silently through the restricted corridors. He did not run. He moved with the steady, unstoppable momentum of a shifting tectonic plate. He ascended the final staircase, leaving the grim lower levels behind. He stepped onto the polished starlight marble of the upper echelon. Directly ahead of him stood the colossal, gilded doors of the High Council Amphitheater, vibrating with the immense, terrifying power of 1,000 elites preparing to end his world. Kaysen gripped the steel wrench tightly, his face an unreadable mask of calm resolve, and walked straight toward the grand doors. The colossal, gilded doors of the High Council Amphitheater towered 50 feet high, forged from pure starlight alloy, and sealed with wards that had not been breached in 10,000 years. Inside, the chamber was a tempest of raw, blinding power. 1,000 high councilors hovered in concentric rings above the crystalline floor, their arms raised, their voices locked in a deafening, harmonious chant. The air itself vibrated with so much quantum resonance that reality began to warp, fracturing the light into violently shifting auroras. At the very center, hovering above the grand podium, an orb of blinding white thermal quantum energy was expanding. This was the ignition spark. In mere moments, it would be hurled through the ether network to awaken the Oblivion Cannon, a weapon stationed on the edge of the galaxy, ready to erase the human solar system from the tapestry of existence. They were gods forging a sun of death. They were completely invincible. Then, the gilded doors groaned. The heavy starlight alloy did not shatter violently, nor did it explode from a magical assault. The doors simply swung open, the ancient wards dying quietly as the hacked station grid surrendered its authority. Kaysenbach stepped across the threshold. The sheer atmospheric pressure of the accumulated magic inside the chamber hit him like a physical wall. It tore at his stained overalls, threatening to crush his fragile human bones into dust. Yet, he did not falter. He stood exactly where he was, a singular speck of grime and grease against a backdrop of divine, blinding radiance. He did not charge the podium. He did not shout a desperate plea for mercy. He did not draw a weapon. Instead, Kaysen simply raised his right hand, holding the heavy, oil-stained steel wrench he had carried up from the slums. With a calm, deliberate release of his fingers, he let it fall. The heavy steel wrench struck the polished obsidian floor. Clang! In a chamber built to perfectly amplify harmonic resonance. The sharp, ugly, utterly non-magical sound of crude metal hitting stone acted like a sonic blade. The harsh acoustic anomaly violently interrupted the precise frequency of the chanting. A ripple of chaotic disruption tore through the assembly. Several counselors gasped, losing their focus. The harmonic link fractured. The blinding white orb of the ignition spark shuddered, stabilizing just barely. But the spell's absolute perfection was shattered. 1,000 glowing eyes snapped toward the entrance. Total, suffocating silence replaced the tempest of magic. Grand Inquisitor. Zale floated down from his elevated position, his pristine robes radiating a furious, scorching azure light. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred when he recognized the grime-covered human scavenger standing in the doorway. "You," Zale hissed, his voice echoing like rolling thunder across the silent amphitheater. "A rat crawls from the deepest trap to stand before the altar of gods. How you escape the core vault matters little. You are entirely too late. Scavenger, look upon the heavens and witness the price of your pathetic defiance." Zale threw his hands forward, channeling his immense will into the massive panoramic holographic display dominating the back wall of the chamber. The screen flared to life, projecting a real-time feed of the human solar system from the Oblivion Cannon's targeting array. "The ignition is complete," Zale declared, his voice rising to a maniacal crescendo. "Fire the weapon. Erase them all." The blinding white spark above the podium vanished, instantly transmitted across the galaxy to the superweapon. On the panoramic display, a beam of concentrated cosmic annihilation, wider than a planet, erupted from the Oblivion Cannon. It tore through the void, a raging torrent of absolute destruction, aimed squarely at the tiny, fragile blue marble of Earth. The elites in the chamber sneered, waiting for the spectacular explosion, waiting for the satisfying end of the inferior species. The beam struck the human system, but the screen did not flash with the light of a dying world. There was no explosion. There was no erasure. Instead, the panoramic display revealed something that defied every known law of galactic physics. Earth did not burn. It illuminated. A sudden, brilliant pulse of golden light erupted from the planet's atmosphere. Instantly, billions of microscopic threads of energy ignited across the deep vacuum of the human solar system. These were the chaotic ether dregs, the toxic waste humanity had spent 80 years scavenging, secretly woven into a colossal, invisible stealth lattice. Now, hit by the immense power of the Oblivion Cannon, the lattice was fully energized. It revealed itself as a staggering, breathtaking infinity matrix, a geometric masterpiece of quantum architecture that completely engulfed the sun, the planets, and every moon. The Oblivion Cannon's apocalyptic beam did not pierce the matrix. It crashed into the outermost layer and was instantly caught, twisted, and bent. The destructive energy was violently refracted, forced to follow the chaotic pathways of the human-made web. Before the horrified eyes of 1,000 High Counselors, the beam of annihilation was transformed into a colossal, glowing bridge of solid starlight, connecting the superweapon directly to the Earth. Earth was not shielding itself. It was drinking the beam. "What is happening?" a High Counselor shrieked, his pristine robes suddenly flickering as the ambient magic in the room began to thin. "The cannon is not destroying them. They are absorbing the payload." "Shut it down!" Zale roared, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "Sever the connection! Cut the ether feed immediately!" "We cannot!" another elite screamed, frantically manipulating a holographic console. "The system is entirely unresponsive. The human system is pulling our reserves. The telemetry virus. It created a two-way conduit. They have bypassed our firewalls." The horrifying truth dawned on the High Council. The humans had never intended to fight a war of attrition. They had used Kassen's infiltration to plant a backdoor virus directly into the Council's central nervous system. When Zale fired the Oblivion Cannon, he did not launch a bomb. He established a direct, unseverable hardline connection between the Ethereum Station's infinite reserves and Earth's hungry infinity matrix. Earth had just hacked the universe. The panoramic screen showed the human matrix glowing brighter and brighter, a magnificent, terrifying web of repurposed chaos, pulling the very lifeblood of the galactic empire across the cosmos. Inside the amphitheater, the disaster struck with catastrophic speed. The cascading failure began. First, the magnificent, glowing auras of the 1,000 elites sputtered and died. The counselors, beings who had not touched the ground in centuries, suddenly screamed as gravity reclaimed them. They fell from the air, crashing onto the obsidian floor in a tangled, undignified mass of silk and broken bones. Then, the station's systems began to collapse. The brilliant starlight chandeliers flickered out, plunging the grand chamber into the harsh, bloody crimson glow of emergency backup lights. Holographic monitors shattered into static. Across the entire galaxy, the Council's invincible armadas dropped out of hyperspace, their engines completely drained. Planetary shields around the elite core worlds collapsed like fragile glass. Automated defense platforms powered down, drifting aimlessly in the void. The absolute, centralized monopoly on ether energy that had kept the Council in power for 10,000 years was being siphoned away in a matter of seconds. The infinite well was running dry. Deafening shrieks of pure terror echoed through the dark amphitheater. The elites scrambled on the floor, their elegant robes torn, their bodies weak and heavy. They clawed at their own throats, suddenly experiencing the suffocating, terrifying reality of existing without magic. The self-proclaimed gods of the cosmos had just been violently forcefully dragged down to the level of mortals. Kassenbach stood completely still near the entrance, bathed in the red emergency light. He did not gloat. He did not laugh. He just watched the architects of universal oppression writhing on the floor, stripped of their stolen divinity. The silence of humanity had ended, replaced by the chaotic, desperate screams of a fallen empire. Amidst the suffocating panic of the crimson-lit amphitheater, a desperate, feral snarl ripped through the air. Grand Inquisitor Zale pulled himself from the tangled mass of fallen elites. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of their former divine grace, refusing to accept the sudden mortality crashing down upon him. Zale turned to the few remaining High Counselors, who still possessed a shred of consciousness. Through sheer, agonizing force of will, they began to violently extract the very last, lingering molecules of ether embedded deep within their own biological cells. It was an act of pure madness, tearing at their own life force to fuel one final strike. The stolen energy coalesced in the space between Zale's trembling hands. It rapidly compressed into a jagged, shrieking sphere of absolute destruction, burning with a sickening, corrupted light, driven by the singular desire for vengeance. Zyle hurled the sphere of death directly at the human scavenger, standing near the doorway. Kassenbach did not flinch. He did not dive for cover. As the lethal projectile closed the distance, Kassen slowly raised his bare right hand. He did not brace for an impact. Instead, he reached out and gently pressed his calloused fingertips against the shrieking surface of the deadly sphere. To the horrified eyes of the council, it looked like a man willingly touching the surface of a star. But Kassen was not looking at fire. His mind, conditioned by decades of translating chaotic magic into absolute mathematics, saw only a tangled knot of quantum strings. With the calm, practiced precision of a mechanic dismantling a faulty engine, Kassen began to pull the variables apart. He mentally unspooled the algorithmic binding, holding the sphere together. He found the central equation of the spell and simply deleted it. The terrifying sphere of destruction did not detonate. Under Kassen's touch, it unraveled entirely. The deafening shriek of the magic faded into a soft sigh as the deadly spell dissolved. It transformed into a gentle shower of harmless, glowing golden particles that drifted lazily down, dusting the dark floor beneath Kassen's heavy work boots. Zale collapsed onto his knees, his mind completely broken by the impossible sight. "You never understood the fundamental nature of a circuit," Kassen spoke, his voice steady and calm, echoing clearly in the stunned silence of the ruined chamber. "For 80 years, humanity scavenged your discarded chaos. We built the wires, the resistors, and the structural lattice in the dark. We built the greatest machine this universe has ever seen. But we lacked a power source massive enough to bridge the final gap. We needed a surge of pure, directional energy to close the loop." Kassen took a slow step forward, looking down at the shivering gods. "We could not reach your central network. But when you ordered your fleet to plug those tethers into our sun, you did exactly what we needed. You did not just try to kill us. You handed us the administrative keys to the entire cosmic ether network." Zale stared up, tears of absolute defeat streaming down his face. "Then strike us down," the Inquisitor whispered, his voice a hollow rasp. "Unleash the weapon, burn our worlds, take your revenge." Kassen looked at the pathetic, broken creatures groveling on the floor. "Revenge is a primitive concept. It is the tool of tyrants. Humanity has no interest in sitting on your stolen throne. We do not want your empire." Raising his hand one last time, Kassen mentally reached into the boundless, roaring ocean of the Infinity Matrix, now completely under Earth's control. He did not issue a command to destroy. He flipped a virtual switch. He initiated a universal system reset. A silent, invisible shockwave of pure harmony blasted outward from the human solar system, sweeping across the entire galaxy in a fraction of a second. Kassan opened the floodgates. The infinite reservoir of ether that the High Council had hoarded and fiercely guarded for 10 millennia was violently ripped from their centralized vaults. But it was not destroyed. It was redistributed, deep in the toxic asteroid mines. The blind Vora suddenly gasped as their eyes filled with radiant, golden light, their vision restored by the sudden influx of healing magic. On the freezing trade hubs, the mute Drek opened their mouths and let out a deafening, joyous roar as the ether repaired their stolen voices. Dead planets suddenly bloomed with vibrant vegetation. The sick were healed. The weak were empowered. The universe was flooded with absolute, unadulterated equality. By freely sharing the infinite power with every single living creature and every lowly species, Kassan completely shattered the foundation of the High Council. Their dictatorial reign crumbled into dust in a single heartbeat, solely because they no longer held a monopoly on strength. When everyone is a god, no one is a slave. The monumental task completed, Kassan turned away from the sobbing elites. He bent down and picked up his heavy, oil-stained steel wrench from the floor. He slipped it back into his pocket. Without a single backward glance, the scavenger walked out of the dark amphitheater, his heavy boots echoing down the silent halls of the fallen empire. Earth had stayed quiet for 80 years, and now, the entire galaxy would finally learn how to listen to them. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners of Sci-fi Stories for staying with us until the very end of this journey. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's story thrilling and meaningful, we humbly ask for your help. Please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link found in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our incredibly hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and continue creating even better stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next adventure.